Trent laughed when the elderly woman asked for a loan against an account she said she'd held since 1974. What he didn't know was that the account number she recited from memory belonged to one of the two men who built this bank from nothing, and that she'd been waiting 27 years for someone inside these walls to finally take her seriously enough to ask why his name wasn't on it anymore. Ruth Sterling had dressed carefully that morning, her good coat, a small clutch purse, sensible shoes for the walk from the bus stop, and still, the moment she stepped up to Trent Holloway's desk at Callahan Trust Bank's downtown branch, she watched him make a decision about her before she'd said a single word. "I'd like to apply for a small loan," she said, setting a folder of documents on his desk. $5,000, against my account here." Trent glanced at her clothes, her purse, the slight tremor in her hands as she opened the folder, and made his own assumption instead of doing his actual job. "Ma'am, do you have a checking account with us currently? Sometimes what people remember as an account from years ago has actually been closed or transferred." "I have an account," Ruth said. "I've had it since 1974. Trent's smile didn't reach his eyes. "That's quite a long time. Do you have your account number?" She recited 11 digits from memory, evenly, without looking anything up. Trent typed them in, frowned at his screen, and typed them again. "I'm not finding anything under that number," he said, though the truth was he'd typed it wrong the second time too, distracted by his own certainty that this couldn't possibly be right. "Ma'am, I think there may be some confusion. Perhaps you're thinking of a different bank." "I'm not confused," Ruth said quietly. Trent, aware now that two other customers in line were watching, decided the fastest way to end an awkward situation was to make it her problem instead of his. "I understand this can be confusing for—" He paused, choosing his next words with the specific carelessness of a man who'd already decided her age explained everything he needed to know. "For people who aren't used to how modern banking works. I'd be happy to help you open a new account today if that would be easier." A woman in line behind her actually flinched at that. Ruth didn't. She'd absorbed considerably worse than condescension in her life, and this, she'd long ago decided, barely registered. "I don't need a new account," she said. "I need you to look up the one I already have." Trent tried the account number a third time, this time actually reading each digit back to her as he typed, and this time something on his screen changed. Not a normal customer record, but a flag, red-bordered, requiring branch manager authorization to view. He frowned. "This account has a compliance hold on it," he said. "That's unusual for a personal account this old." "It's not unusual," Ruth said. "It's exactly what I'd expect." Something in her tone made Trent look at her properly, for the first time since she'd sat down. Really look. The way you look at someone once a detail refuses to fit the story you'd already decided about them. "How long did you say you've had this account?" he asked. "Since 1974, Ruth said. "Before this bank was called Callahan Trust, back when it still had two names on the door instead of one." Trent didn't know the bank's history well enough to understand what she meant by that, but an older teller 2 windows down, a woman named Frances, who'd worked at that branch for 31 years, had heard the exchange and gone very still, her own transaction with a customer forgotten mid-sentence. "Frances," Trent called over, more out of frustration than any real expectation she'd know something useful. "Do you recognize the name Ruth Sterling?" Frances's face did something complicated. "Sterling," she repeated slowly. "As in—" She didn't finish the sentence. She excused herself from her own customer and walked quickly toward the back office, leaving Trent more confused than he'd been a minute earlier, and Ruth sitting exactly as calm as she'd been since she walked through the door. "What was that about?" Trent asked her. "You'll want to wait and see," Ruth said, folding her hands in her lap. He tried the account again, clicking through screens he didn't have full authorization to open, and found a scanned document attached to the file. Old, the paper yellowed, a partnership agreement dated 1974, with 2 signatures at the bottom. He could make out one name clearly, Harold Sterling. The second signature had been crossed through with a single decisive line decades ago, the ink gone brown with age. "Sterling," Trent said quietly, mostly to himself. "Sterling and Callahan?" He looked up the bank's official history on his own internal system, the same corporate blurb every employee got during onboarding, the one that credited visionary founder Arthur Callahan with building the institution from a single storefront branch into a regional financial powerhouse. There was no mention of a partner. There never had been, not in any version of the story Trent had ever been told. This bank was called Sterling and Callahan Trust for its first 6 years, Ruth said quietly, watching him read, "before my husband's partner decided one name looked better on the letterhead than two." Trent looked up at her, and for the first time since she'd sat down, he didn't have a single dismissive thing left to say. He should have called the branch manager immediately. Instead, some part of Trent, embarrassed now, aware that 2 other employees were watching, unwilling to simply admit he'd misjudged an elderly woman in a worn coat, decided the fastest way to save face was to prove she was the one who'd made the mistake. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to explain exactly what you're claiming here," he said, voice sharpening into something closer to accusation than customer service. "Because if you're suggesting some kind of ownership stake in this institution, that's a serious claim to make, and I'd be very careful about—" "I'm not claiming anything," Ruth said. "I'm asking for a $5,000 loan against an account that has sat untouched, collecting interest for 27 years. That's all I came in for today." "An account this size doesn't just sit untouched," Trent said, more to the small crowd that had gathered near his desk than to Ruth directly. "I think what's actually happening is that you found some old paperwork somewhere, and you're under the impression it entitles you to something. I've seen this before. It happens." The accusation hung in the air, uglier than anything he'd said yet, close enough to calling an elderly widow a fraud in front of a full lobby that even the customer waiting behind her looked uncomfortable. "I'd like to speak to your manager," Ruth said, still perfectly calm. "My manager is going to tell you exactly what I'm telling you," Trent said, though he had no actual idea whether that was true, and some part of him already suspected, watching Frances hurry back from the back office with 2 other people in suits behind her, that it very much was not. He pressed on anyway, the specific stubbornness of a man who'd rather double down than admit, in front of an audience, that he might have spent the last 15 minutes insulting the wrong person entirely. "I'm going to need to flag this interaction for our fraud department," he said, reaching for his phone. "Claims of historical ownership stakes are exactly the kind of thing we're trained to watch for." "Trent?" The voice came from behind him, quiet but absolutely final, belonging to a woman in a gray suit who'd just crossed the lobby faster than anyone in a gray suit generally moves. "Step away from that desk. Now." He turned, phone still in hand, and found himself looking at Diane Kessler, the bank's regional board liaison, a woman he'd met exactly twice in 18 months of employment, both times in settings considerably more formal than an open lobby on a Tuesday afternoon. "Ms. Kessler, I was just handling a customer situation that required—" "I know exactly what you were handling," Kessler said, not looking at him at all, her attention entirely on the woman still seated calmly at his desk. "Mrs. Sterling, I am so sorry. We were not informed you'd be visiting today." The lobby, which had been quietly watching an old woman get humiliated for the better part of 15 minutes, went completely, uniformly silent. "Mrs. Sterling?" Trent repeated, the name landing somewhere between confusion and the first genuine flicker of dread he'd felt all day. Diane Kessler didn't answer him directly. She addressed Ruth instead, her voice carrying the specific formality reserved for people considerably more important than the average branch customer. "The full board has been aware of the terms of your late husband's estate for years, Mrs. Sterling. We've simply never had the opportunity to actually meet you in person." "I've never wanted the opportunity," Ruth said, "until today." Kessler turned, finally, to Trent, and her expression made it clear exactly how much trouble he was standing in. "Do you understand what account you've spent the last 15 minutes accusing of fraud?" Trent said nothing, because he genuinely didn't, not yet, not fully. Harold Sterling co-founded this institution in 1974, Kessler said, loud enough now that the entire lobby could hear every word. He and Arthur Callahan built it together from a single storefront branch. 6 years later, Callahan forced Sterling out through a partnership dispute that, by every account still on file in this building's own archives, was engineered rather than earned. Sterling's name came off the letterhead. His shares were bought out under duress at a fraction of their actual value. He died 11 years later, believing this bank had erased him from its own history entirely. She paused, letting that land. Mrs. Sterling did not sell out easily, Kessler continued. She retained a minority trust position her husband had quietly protected in both their names before the partnership dissolved, a position this board has watched grow silently for 27 years into a controlling interest in this institution's parent holding company. Mrs. Sterling isn't asking this bank for a $5,000 loan today, Trent. She's the single largest shareholder this bank has ever had, and she's been waiting 27 years to see, in person, exactly how this institution treats an ordinary woman who walks in asking for something modest. Trent's face had gone the specific color of a man watching an entire morning rearrange itself into something considerably worse than he'd imagined possible. "You just spent 15 minutes accusing her of fraud," Kessler said quietly, "in front of a full lobby, because you decided her coat told you everything you needed to know about whether she deserved to be taken seriously." Trent was placed on administrative leave before the end of the day, pending a formal review that, within the week, ended his employment at Callahan Trust entirely, not for a single procedural error, but for what the board's internal report described as a pattern of customer treatment inconsistent with the institution's stated values, a pattern Ruth's visit had simply made impossible to keep overlooking. The loan itself was approved within the hour. The compliance hold lifted the moment Kessler personally authorized it. $5,000 transferred to help pay for Ruth's granddaughter's first semester of nursing school, a fact Ruth had never once bothered mentioning to Trent because, she said later, she'd stopped expecting anyone at that desk to actually ask. The board convened an emergency session 2 days later, not primarily about Trent, but about the compliance flag itself, the specific internal marker that had sat on Ruth's account for 27 years, quietly restricting frontline staff from ever actually seeing the full history attached to it, a flag several board members admitted, uncomfortably, had likely been placed decades earlier, specifically to prevent exactly the kind of scrutiny Ruth's visit had just forced into the open. Arthur Callahan had died 9 years earlier. His children, who now sat on the same board Ruth's trust quietly controlled a majority stake in, issued a private apology to Ruth within the month, along with a considerably more public one, a formal restoration of Harold Sterling's name to the bank's official history, a bronze plaque commissioned for the downtown lobby, and a scholarship fund established in his name for first-generation banking students, the first grant awarded, fittingly, to a young woman studying nursing rather than finance. A local reporter asked Ruth, at the small ceremony unveiling the plaque, whether it felt satisfying to finally take back what had been stolen from her husband decades earlier. Ruth considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I didn't come here for satisfaction," she said. "I came here because for 27 years, everyone who ever asked about Harold got told the same story, that Arthur Callahan built this bank alone, that Harold was simply an early employee who moved on. I let that story stand for a long time because fighting it felt like it would cost more than it was worth, and because Harold himself asked me, before he died, not to spend my life bitter over something neither of us could undo." She looked at the plaque, at her husband's name freshly cast in bronze beside a founding date that finally told the truth. "I wasn't trying to punish anyone today," she said. "I wasn't even trying to take back what was taken. I only wanted, just once, for someone inside these walls to actually look at me and remember that my husband built this place with his own 2 hands, and that the woman standing in front of them still remembers exactly how that felt, even 27 years later." She paused, and the reporter, along with everyone else gathered in that lobby, understood, finally, exactly what the entire morning had actually been about. "Trent didn't insult a customer that day," Ruth said quietly. "He insulted a memory I'd spent 27 years protecting. I didn't need this bank's money. I needed, just once, for somebody to finally remember what actually happened here." If you've ever waited years for someone to finally see the truth you'd been carrying quietly, tell us in the comments below. And if this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this one.